but it looks like one of their largest facilities. Certainly this attack appears to be one of the largest in terms of numbers of drones used, and then the impact. And a storage site for what appears to be a combination of artillery, ammunition, multiple launch rocket systems, and potentially some of their longer range cruise missiles. So there will be interest in whether or not the Russian strike campaign against critical infrastructure in Ukraine and power continues and begins to escalate. I think there will be interest in any evidence that they've actually managed to assemble a decent reserve to counterattack in Kursk in serious volume. I think the question of Ukrainian performance in Kursk and particularly casualties, I wouldn't expect a lot of that to come out because the Ukrainians are obviously quite reticent to release that, but like understanding how that is going. And then I think actually it's the big background picture. How is Ukrainian mobilization and training going? And are they now overcoming the challenges that they faced in putting together those large and well-equipped forces who have trained on the equipment that they're using to present their ability to go again next year? Because that is set against Russian headlines on mobilization, where they've just talked about mobilizing several 100,000 more to hit this target of 1.5 million. The Russians thus far have largely been able to recruit against their losses. They're taking horrendous losses, but they are covering them. But the question will be is, can they keep on doing that? And actually, at what point does their defense industry have to move from refurbishment of existing equipment to increasing production of new equipment? Because they're running out of old stuff to basically refurbish. And their defense industry might face a crunch period, it potentially into much later next year, but their reserves are not infinite either. And so actually what people are trying to divine is stuff that naturally they want to keep private, which is what's their industrial base looking like? And we and others will of course be looking at the European industrial base. Has Europe hit its targets for increased artillery production? What is it providing now, as well as the US, to Ukraine?
Let's talk about Ukraine's drone attack on the ammunition depot deep inside Russia in the Tver region. The explosions caused a huge fire, even a mini earthquake we're hearing. Can you tell us a bit more about this depot and how its targeting fits in with Ukraine's ongoing deep strike campaign?
Say that I don't have sort of deep in-depth knowledge of the depot, but this is one that's hundreds of kilometers deep into Russia, so it's beyond the range of some of the discussion that's been taking place around Western supplied weapons. But it looks like one of their largest facilities. Certainly this attack appears to be one of the largest in terms of numbers of drones used, and then the impact. And a storage site for what appears to be a combination of artillery, ammunition, multiple launch rocket systems, and potentially some of their longer range cruise missiles. So sort of lots put in a location that is quite deep inside Russia. What this fits into is the Ukrainian campaign to try and, if you like, eat into those industrial advantages that the Russians have. What they've been doing over the past 18 months is a combination of refurbishing existing and older equipment, pulling stuff almost out of museums to keep the land campaign going, backed up by a huge increase in artillery production, and then the production of newer air-launched cruise missiles and those kind of weapons, that the very long-range things that they hit the Ukrainians with. And you can look at this as an attempt to really try and begin to undercut that supply, some of which could be going to the front line now, but a lot of it is that deeper stockpile of weapons that the Russians are kind of have begun building up as part of that broader industrial advantage.
And why do you think that Russia's air defences failed to protect a military site of such significance?
I mean, that is a huge question. There are bits and pieces of reporting and some of it sort of media leaks that are coming out, and it's often difficult to know, particularly at this stage, which of these is true. There's a couple of factors at play. Some of this is that Russian air defenses across the board have been stretched by the increase in Ukrainian drone attacks. So some of the questions have been, for example, around, well, what is there around Moscow? Now, that mostly looks like it's been intact, but there is some evidence that things might have been moved around. The way that the Ukrainians have been launching drones against targets, not just directly northwards, but northeast or out to the east, they've hit a number of air bases. Some of those are sort of token strikes, but the point that they've been making fundamentally is that they can launch drones at ranges over 1,000 kilometers and hit targets in a number of directions. And so fundamentally, the Russians have a finite supply of air defenses. Lots of the ones that were in Crimea have been destroyed and need replacing. And they're having to move them around, and that unnecessarily keeps gaps. Now, that doesn't explain what happens to the air defenses that were at the site itself, and on that score, we don't know yet. And there is also some suggestions of incompetence in that lots of the weapons weren't stored deep in buried bunkers, but might actually have been out in the open.
Is it also possible that Ukraine might have found a weak spot where, in a country as vast as Russia, neither its long-range defensive missiles nor its short-range missiles can defend all of its airfields, refineries and military headquarters?
I mean, there is fundamentally a challenge of spreading themselves thinly. I mean, they can't put extensive air defenses absolutely everywhere because of the sheer volume of targets. Now, in some respects, that's part of the Russian advantage. They have so much industry and so much production capacity in any number of areas that gives them a fair degree of resilience. So I don't think we should look to things suddenly drying up on the front line immediately. But at the same time, they can't defend everywhere at once in depth. And that gives the Ukrainians options to basically pick and choose their targets, provided they can get enough of the drones through. And I think it is worth emphasizing what we often see is the end result. We see a handful of drones getting through. What's of interest in terms of their effectiveness is how many did they have to launch to get those handful through at the end.
So getting the drones through, but also getting the drones in the first place, because if Europe were able to ramp up their production of drones and provide them to Ukraine, how much of a difference could that make?
I mean, it's one of the areas where in the debate over the supply of Western long-range weapons, some of the suggestions are that this is actually a better bet in the medium to long term, which is Ukraine has got a thriving and growing industrial base in drone production, but it's certainly an area where there has been support from international partners to date because they've talked about it, and it's potentially very fertile ground for future investment. I think the bit that is important, though, is for the time being, whilst these drones have very long range, they're not necessarily particularly stealthy. There's also an issue over their warhead size, which is that many of these are smaller warheads. They're not going to penetrate buried or heavily protected targets. So investment in new types of drones would be valuable. And we've seen the Ukrainians actually talk about that recently, a kind of a new either rocket or essentially something that looks a lot like a cruise missile, but is being described as a drone. So at some point, the Ukrainians want to equip long-range drones with larger or more sophisticated warheads.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.